And we're live. Guys, today, this month, how to set up franchise territories without sabotaging growth. We're going to talk about service-based businesses, retail businesses, and most important, Kelley's going to share some important insights, really not sabotaging growth, setting up territories to scale and grow. So Kelley, if I could frame this and I'll start the conversation. One of the biggest issues we see with successful emerging franchisors, they've grown, they've sold franchises, they've gotten to royalty sufficiency. Maybe they're 2 or 3 years into the journey or more. And when we look under the hood, there's territory type issues. Franchisees either in multiple territories that are underperforming or franchisees in different size territories, some double or triple the size of others. We also see issues with the franchise offering itself. And so, for example, how do you compare the data for a franchisee in a smaller territory to the data to someone in a much bigger territory? So generally what we're seeing as a franchise law firm, successful brands come to us in a couple of, here's some signs of the issues. One, Charles, we have so many underperforming franchisees. They're great franchisees. They're doing well as if they were in one territory or smaller territory, but they're not really marketing and tapping into the overall market. Another item that comes up is, Charles, we're a mobile service business and we have franchisees with multiple franchise agreements as if they're separate franchise offerings, but they're operating them as one business. And how do we reconcile all these things? So when I'm looking at territory issues for emerging brands, the things I'm looking at, number one, legally, what's the territory we're offering, right? And usually there too, has it been structured for their market, whether it's qualified households, whether it's for another demographic? Item 19, is the item 19 data synthesized? So when you're comparing franchisee A to franchisee B, the territories align. And if they're different types of territories, are we communicating that? And then also even in the retail space, selling, single units, multi-units. So I think one of the biggest opportunities we see for just royalty sufficient franchises is like to correct their territory structures, which a lot of work we've been doing. But let me turn that over. I know I hit a bunch of topics. Kelley, what were your experiences? And again, what we want to do in this live stream today is let's raise the issues, and we want to talk about how we could prevent territory missteps from sabotaging growth.
Yeah, it's such an important topic, and it's not one that as a franchisor, I didn't realize how important it was until it got out of control. And, I think one of the lessons I learned, the first lesson I learned, was giving too much too early. And, we see this a lot with franchisors when your first, couple franchisees, we're just so excited to have a franchisee that we're like, hey, take this entire city as a territory. That's what I did, which can be problematic for a number of reasons later on. And item 19, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, that was our biggest undertaking to have to correct the mistakes we made. But also, what do you do if you give someone a territory of that size and they don't perform? In hindsight, I would have, if we wanted that sale and we wanted to give a bigger area to get it, I would have given it conditionally. You have first rights to all of San Antonio. Start in this small area, prove your growth, and we'll continue to give you more territory. But it wouldn't have taken away our ability to sell the rest of that area for the next 10 years. It's really easy, I think, to fall into that with your first few franchisees.
Kelley, that's practical. Like that's really good practical advice. So let's just dive into that a little, right? For sure, selling too much territory too early. And we also see this with more mature private equity backed brands also. And also I think in the industry, there's a push, especially in the service businesses where brokers want to see you sell multiple territories, right? So for sure, we do see the issues of selling too much too early. I like when you're advising, hey, give a right of first refusal. What I'm really hearing too is you're saying don't sell those extra territories. Have the discipline to just sell them what you think they're going to perform with. And I think brokers eventually will respect that, and the franchisee candidates will do that. But I think it's important to hold back on those sales.
Yeah, it's hard to do in the beginning, especially. And I will, because you mentioned brokers, we had some broker networks that wouldn't work with us because we offered that. And that's okay. That's what was for us. And our first right of refusal evolved over time too, Charles. I mean, in the beginning, it was like, in 6 months, you can buy this. And then in 18, and then later it became, if in full compliance, if you're meeting these sales standards, if you're, and it really became more about the franchisee proving that they can take on more territory. And also us showing that we are going to support them enough for them to feel confident to take on more territory. So it definitely, is a better growth relationship when we set it up like that.
Well, and to add again, because we don't want to sabotage growth, right? And to your point, you're an early stage franchisor, you feel that pressure to sell more territories, more initial fee. On the flip side of that, right, Kelley's advice is don't and have the discipline. But I also think economically it's to your advantage, because now as a franchisor, when you get to year 2 or 3 with that franchisee, if you sold multiple territories and they're underperforming, it's going to kill your item 19, right? Everyone's going to ask, why do they have 3 territories and they only have the sales of 1? And I feel like it could also impact franchisee validation.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think slow growth becomes fast growth, and I think holding back on those sales will actually sell more later. Kelley, to another one of your points, and Norman had asked this question, which is, and I think we may disagree on this a little, Kelley, but should we add KPIs to retain exclusivity for a territory? When we're preparing FDDs, especially in the service-based arena, one of my concerns as a franchise lawyer is we have franchise relationship laws that make it very difficult to go to a franchisee and say, hey, you didn't meet X, Y, and Z in sales, so I'm taking back the territory, right? Some state laws prohibit it. And even the ones that don't, what I don't like about that scenario is now I'm taking something from them. They go hire a franchise lawyer. They claim we're not supporting. I created a litigation event. So one of my preferences always is if we're awarding territories, you buy 1 territory, 2, 3, that the policing mechanism be minimum royalties. Meaning if you're going to buy 2, your minimum royalties go up and your local marketing spend goes up. How do you, and I think we disagree with that a little, but how do you feel about that?
We had some KPIs we required. Ours actually were, we only had 2. It was marketing spend and it was gross sales, minimum gross sales. And I think, to set expectations, I liked having it in there. But to your point, would we ever be able to actually have enforced it? Doubtful. We attempted to on a few times with franchisees that were underperforming. And to, your point, Charles, the argument was always, okay, yeah, we are, but it's because you fell short here and you fell short here as a franchisor. And, I would obviously disagree, even though no one's perfect. But you really get into this thing of like, well, who actually defaulted their obligations per the franchise agreement with that? And so, it's difficult. And so I think, the lesson I learned was, again, controlling growth. I was actually just talking to a franchisor about this the other day, wanting to give people bigger territories. And then, but they just stopped growing. And I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. Someone, you could say, hey, you can make X number of dollars, $500,000 a year, and you have 3 territories. And so they buy 1. And that territory is killing it. And they're making $500,000 a year. And that's a lot of money for them. Why are they going to grow 2 and 3? It doesn't hurt them to not grow 2 and 3. It's more work. But then we've lost that territory. And so, even if that minimum, I don't think, while as a franchisor wanted to have some expectations in place, I do think it's hard to enforce, especially once we get into these larger and larger territory sizes.
Yeah, I think those are fair points, right? I mean, the way, if you said, Charles, I want them to produce a minimum of X a month in sales, I would just take that number, multiply it by the royalty and say that's your minimum royalty obligation. And what we found with that is rather than having the adversarial relationship, the franchisees would come back to franchisor and say, hey, I 3 territories too much for me. Can I give back 2 and revert back to a single territory royalty? So that was something, that we found pretty favorable. But Kelley, again, and we're going to go into retail and restaurants also. One, conversation I had today, and something that comes up often for service businesses, is that I'll have a conversation and our client will tell us, yeah, Charles, we allow franchisees, especially in brand new markets, there's a customer just outside their territory, we allow them to service them. And my initial response is, we really can't do that. Or we can, but we have to create in our agreement infrastructure what we call an open area. What are the rights there? How they revert back? Did you have any issues about franchisees going out of territory?
Yes, but really the only time we saw an issue is when they were crossing into someone else's. So, we did have an open territory clause, and the way ours worked was anyone could do events in that open area, do marketing events. We encouraged them to collaborate with other franchisees who are nearby. But when a lead came in, it had to go into our CRM, and our CRM would determine which franchisee was geographically closest to that line, and that's who got that lead. But there were sometimes issues, and I think the biggest issue we saw with that was when we had an open area and we allowed people to operate in it, and then we sold that open area. Because at what point does that open area now belong to that franchisee? And what if referrals came from that open area because the other franchisee trained someone's dog, or leads are still coming in from an event that they paid for? That's when it can get a little bit sticky. And that's where we would see issues is, they're like, yeah, I know that person owns the territory now, but I put in all the work to get the leads.
Right.
You did. We didn't ask you to. But yes, you did. And so I think having that really clearly defined legally is important.
And it legally and also in the operations manual, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, hey, you have to turn over these customers. Kelley, the less of a legal issue, more of a business decision, franchise sales. So when you're awarding territories, naturally franchise buyers want to cherry pick territory. As you lead a franchise organization, as you're evaluating territories and franchisees, go through the decision-making process and even some of the conversation of what's relevant. Franchisee comes in, they want to buy 1 or 2 territories. They may be leaning to a particular area. What decision-making goes into it from your team in terms of, hey, franchisee, well, you can't just have this area by itself. You also have to have this territory. Here's our reasoning behind it. Here's how we're mapping it out. Behind the scenes, what's involved there?
That's an amazing question. That's the second biggest mistake I made early on, was not investing in mapping services early enough. I would sit there with my screen. I'd have like my city maps data up, and I'd have my Google Maps and my little like tablet pen, like drawing territories, trying to figure out populations and demographics. And I did what I had to do. But, I think having the right mapping system that pulls in the demographics that you determine are best for your business is really important. And pre-mapping is really important. So, in the beginning, yes, people would come to us and they'd say, here are the zip codes we want. I'm like, okay, perfect. I plug them all in. Of course, it's the best zip codes in the city. And there's huge holes. There's like holes in the zip codes that we could never sell, right? Neighborhoods we would never sell. And that became problematic. We had some cities then that, probably could have supported 5 franchisees, but ultimately only were able to support 2 because of the way we mapped them out in the beginning. The with some of these mapping softwares that exist now, you can pre-map the country based on your demographics, the population you need, the number of households, the number of people, the income level. For us, number of dogs in the home, whatever that looks like. So behind the scenes for us, when we have franchisees coming to us looking, they tell us what area they were interested in. Maybe it's Cincinnati, Ohio. And then we would say, here are the territories that are available. We didn't get into a lot of custom mapping. And it worked much better for us that way. It frustrated some people, certainly. And every once in a while, we could maybe move 1 or 2 zip codes around. But as far as optimizing your ability to sell, like having those predetermined territories is absolutely priceless.
I love that advice. So if I'm a franchisor, I have a new market, someone's entering, I know they want that area. Your advice is go in, pre-map the entire area, and then present that to the franchisee candidate for them to look at.
Absolutely. Okay, these are the predetermined areas. Which one would you like? But you want to make sure you have a mix of the best and some of the not ideal locations, right? That has to all mix together. Otherwise, you're going to end up having a franchisee that can support one corner of the city and the rest is just dead space.
And Kelley, I know it's a general question, and it's really going to be subjective on, ability and finances. How would you approach the process? Like, what was the typical scenario? A franchisee comes in, they want one territory, multiple territories. Like, what would you be evaluating when you decided, hey, we're only going to award you this one territory, or where you think they may be able to support more than one?
Yeah, one was capital, obviously, and we would do more than just look at their capital numbers. It's more about just what liquid do you have, what's your assets. We would do kind of a study that looked at what capital they have available now, and is it going to be sustainable over 3 years? Some people are like, yeah, I have like $300,000 right now. I can throw that down, and that's all I have. That's probably great for one territory, but to continue growth of 3 additional, it needs to be a much larger number. But even more than that, is their understanding of how to scale a business. And so we had a slide deck pretty much that we required people to go through and tell us what their 3-year plan was going to be. How are you going to scale? Where are you getting, which territory would you open first, second, and third? And how would you grow into those territories? What do you think your spend is going to be? How are your expenses going to increase? And of course, they're not going to get that 100% right. They're not in the business yet, but we want to know that they're in the growth mindset before we give them a growth opportunity.
So before even signing a franchise agreement, you're talking about that 3-year plan.
We are. Yeah. We had quite a few, homework assignments that we required along that franchise development process, that sales process, to make sure that they, really understood what they were committing to before they were ever given the opportunity to commit.
What I love about that is, so many times franchises are awarded, and by year 2 or 3, they're still operating as if they had one franchise or one territory. And there's not that lever to push them forward. When you're thinking about those 3-year plans or whatnot, and how a franchisee is going to maximize a territory and really grow into it, what are the key factors? Is it marketing spend, building up team? Like, what were the things you were evaluating?
Yeah, so we were service-based. So certainly we were marketing spend. How is that going to increase with time? Which employees are you going to add and when? And where are they strategically going to be located? Because, we were a mobile concept. And so making sure people were hiring in the right areas were really important as well. We required additional websites. If you went outside of a certain radius, we required additional social media presence. If this second territory was identifiably different than this market. And so, we required them to almost open up micro businesses within each of those locations and operate them as such, including even, separating some numbers out for the item 19, if applicable. So, we basically made them replicate that first model over and over, instead of just being able to, turn on an ad in this zip code, maybe pull some people in. They were relaunching each time. It's similar to what you would do with like a retail space, even though we were service-based.
But I think that's the right approach, right? Because if you're a service business, multi-territories, and you treat it like it's retail, it becomes a lot more real. And again, the conversations we're having is, I think it's because they're just treating more territory as more territory and not as another business segment.
I agree. And it's easy to do. I mean, especially as a franchisee, of course, they just want to just keep running, just get more clients, but keep running. But as well as, most, you have to keep reinvesting into that growth. And it's easier to wrap your brain around when you're looking at it as a separate entity, another location.
Kelley, Lee, thoughts on splitting up single cities? They're just too big to sell as one territory. Currently, we use cardinal direction, i.e. North Victoria versus South Victoria. Is that a bad idea? And this is a service business, Lee's.
We set up lots of single cities with multiple franchisees. I think the largest we probably had is we had in the Houston area 5 franchisees, and also set up North Houston, East, West, so similar. And, there's lots of pros and cons, mostly pros, though. I think, the most important thing to do there is, for us was setting up protected zip codes. So we knew our franchisees weren't competing with each other. They were working together to build up their, brand presence, their credibility, their SEO together. I've seen some service brands that have multiple franchisees in one city, and it's like open zip codes. Everyone can go everywhere. And that I think has a lot of potential to go wrong. But having multiple franchisees in one metropolitan area can actually be really, really strong, especially if you utilize shared resources for events, shared website for SEO presence and marketing dollars. There's a lot of positive things that can come out of that.
Kelley, let's talk more about that. So like a Houston market, to Lee's point, and I agree, you need protection, right? If you have one area, but talk about the shared resources. How do you because I agree, it could be a big advantage. How do you get those franchisees to collaborate? And what were some did you have them sharing marketing spend, or, how did they collaborate?
So yeah, there's quite a few ways. And it didn't always go perfectly smoothly in the beginning. But there are a few ways. One is they had a shared website. So, each of our franchisees had a full website, full domain presence, but they shared one. And that helped and boost their SEO presence significantly because they weren't fighting for that space in Google with the Houston word. Right. They did events together. So if one person was having a huge event in South Houston, the other franchisees would come help run the event. They'd help pay for the event. And then the leads would go where the leads came from, because people come from all over to go to those events. So they could do larger events, have a larger space, because they were sharing both staffing and the cost of the event. And while they all did have their own independent marketing spend, anytime we had multiple owners in a city like that, we did require a multi-location brand fund, where they would each chip in and do some sort of advertising for their entire city, and report what that was. We wanted to make sure we were keeping it fair, that one franchisee wasn't investing 10% of the marketing for that city and someone else is doing 0.5%. So, they did meet quarterly, at least biannually, and decide as a team where their shared marketing dollars were going to go each year.
Ashley, I get this is going to depend on the business, right? Ashley's question: what do you think is the best formula to determine a single unit territory? For me, and it'd be good to understand the context, because when we're working on territory structures, it really depends on the business itself, right?
Right.
What does the business model look like? Where are your customers coming from? And what's a fair demographic to measure a territory, right? Is it, if it's a service business, is it household income? Is it pet ownership? Is it children? Is it neighboring schools, preschools, right? That'll vary. But when we're looking at that, the conversation I'm having with our clients is for the opportunity we're offering and everything you know about the business, if we're an income replacement business, how does one territory satisfy that requirement? And what's the demographics and data that we need to support it, right? I think that's how we've been backing into it along the way. I mean, it's just so interesting, the data we see, because we see so many franchisors when we're rebooting, they have generic information. I'm like, why'd you pick this data? It's like, we just picked it, or our attorney said, or consultant. How would you recommend someone starting off fresh? What would be like some checklist items? I think, Kelley, would you start with that one territory needs to be that income replacement business, if that's the area you're in, like, because
Right.
otherwise it becomes a fiction, no?
No, I totally agree. I mean, and I think that's kind of the false advertising that some people fall into. Like, this is going to be income replacement. Look at these numbers of this person who owns 10 units. Like it has to be more realistic than that. And so, and I see a lot of people that will have their territory just be population based, but it has to be a population within a certain demographic, right? So example, I mean, ours was 225,000 people who make over $75,000 a year, because we know, and not in the beginning, we didn't know, like, you do your best in the beginning and you really, I think, figure out your territory demographics as you grow. Because if, say, you're starting in Toledo, this is what your demographics have to be in Toledo. But then you open up in Manhattan and you open up in Phoenix, and you're going to be like, okay, well, the Toledo demographics were actually the bare minimum. We actually should have, add some other things as you're scaling. But because of that, not all territories are completely created equal, as long as your standard is in place and you can show it. So for us, 225,000 people make $60,000. In one city, that might be this big on the map. In another city, it might be this big on the map. It's still the same number of qualified people in that territory. And so I think, as a franchisor, that's what we want to think through too. Is this just a hard number, or is this a qualified number, qualified, customer number? And whichever way you go, you really need to commit to that. And, or else your item 19 is going to get pretty hairy.
Yeah. And I think also too, you need to consider, so you have those objective criteria, right, which are going to be critical, but also you need to consider the operational reality, right? So if you have X number of households or population, but you're driving an hour and a half, to get to parts of your territory, that may or may not be practical for the business, right? So all those factors have to come in. I mean, even as we're developing FDDs, we've also found unique opportunities. Where certain brands, where their service may be in more demand of certain parts of the country due to climate or other things. So where the service is more in demand, the territory is smaller than a market that's not as active, right? So we're broadening the base. So I think that all comes in. But one thing also that I see is sometimes franchisors are like, 2 territories doesn't mean double the income.
Right.
And if you maximize a single territory, which, Kelley, gets to your original point or mistake you made, which is giving up too much territory, because it does dilute what's going on for the franchisees and the item 19. And guys, especially for the emerging brands, that multi-territory sale or multi-unit sale today may feel good, but it could be dragging down item 19 and the FDD in year 2 and 3. Or it could be dragging down validation.
Yeah.
Kelley, if we were going by lessons learned, your first one was about giving up too much territory. Your second was not pre-mapping before selling, which I love that point. What would be a third one that pops up? Like,
I think it comes into, for us, it was just a lesson learned, the hard way. But I think at the end of the day, it's an ethics lesson too, and that you know your brand better than other people do. So do not let them map it or convince you that a territory is viable. We had people who would come to us, particularly once we started working with some sales organizations, like, hey, this person really wants to buy a territory in, you name it, Nebraska. And we're like, yeah, that territory doesn't seem like it's a viable choice for us. It doesn't meet our minimum requirements. And like, no, but they understand they don't need to make as much. They're just really passionate about the business. This market could be great for you. And one time and one time only, fortunately, we were sold. We're like, okay, well, this person knows their market better than we do. They didn't. And it was a struggle. And, so I think just as important as mapping out the right territories and knowing how to grow, you also need to know what the wrong territories are for your business, and not let someone convince you otherwise that your model's going to work there if you know it's not. Because one, it's going to cause a lot of heartache for you, the franchisee, and your item 19.
We see that come up often. That comes up often. And then, just to plan ahead a little, to your point, Kelley, and item 19, then we run into questions of how do we present the data in item 19? Technically, maybe it's smaller than our standard territory. How do, it does create issues.
Or it's bigger, or like this area should, be 10 territories, but they're performing at 1. It's just, that's the other thing we saw happen, and that was bad.
Well, and we see that often. Again, really well-meaning, good franchisors. Where in the beginning you've sold really big territory.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, though, I don't think the legal, they're not presenting that the right way in the item 19. And it takes some reworking.
We certainly weren't in the beginning. And then when we had to change it, it looked devastating. So I go back, we sold a territory to our first franchisee. It was a single territory, 4 million people. Guys, that is not a single territory, but it was to us on our first franchise sale. We knew it didn't fall in line. Our FDD, be clear, didn't say 4 million people was one franchise. But we were like, well, it's our first franchisee. We want to give them this whole area, which is all well and great. And they performed really well. But as we scaled, and then we had to go back and redo the FDD to show the actual number of territories, because we couldn't show that they were making $4 million a year with one territory, because they have access to 40 territories. So then when you start doing that division and they're 4 million based on 40 territories, doesn't look so hot. And so it's definitely something you want to be thinking about early on.
And that comes up often. That correction point, that bump in the road, so many franchisors have to take it. It'd be great if you avoid it. But you're right. You have to navigate that. And it looks a little odd when you're synthesizing it, but if a franchisor is experiencing it, they're not alone, right?
Absolutely.
And then, we haven't talked much about retail businesses and, for restaurants, brick and mortar. What we're seeing from a territory standpoint is a couple of things I'll throw out there is, if you're retail, you really need to be cautious about reserving rights and accounting for how you deal with e-commerce, which is big, right? So if you're going to private label a product or sell through e-commerce, how does that work? If someone in a franchisee's territory buys a product through e-commerce, are they getting a credit for that? So I think there's big opportunity for brands to differentiate on the retail end also, whether it be e-commerce or, certain reserve rights. In the restaurant space, the third-party delivery services, it's having a big impact on, for sure, how we structure FDDs, legal structures, but also the rights you need to be reserving and communicating with franchisees about the potential of some overlap there. Let's see. What if your territories are smaller than people are expecting? Best sales advice. We know the model and the demographics needed to succeed, but it often overwhelms prospects.
I mean, I think, Lee, as long as you have a strong FDD, you can, show that, people are performing in these smaller territories just fine. If you're not to that point yet and you're still pretty early on, I think it's the quality over quantity approach is really really good, and our space was actually kind of similar to that. We were a really high priced product. And so we were going after a very small market of people. And I think, when you're talking to people about the smaller territory size, saying, hey, we've really identified who your client is in this smaller space. And, we're going to save you lots of marketing time and dollars by being able to attract people in a smaller space. The amount of clients they can get in, the amount, of resources that they won't need for travel time and all of these things. I think there's a lot you can highlight in that to make it, clear that they're really gaining more by not having to be able to focus their attention in a smaller area.
And to that point, Kelley, and to Lee's question, I mean, this question may be a signal, although Lee is ahead of the curve here. He's bringing it up, is from a sales perspective, I think it's to take more control over the conversation, right? In the presentation and in the process of, here's what we base our formula on. Here's how we set up territories. This is why this works. For the right candidate, we have single territory, certain markets, multiple. And so I think it's a lot of front running in terms of pre-educating the candidate about the territories, about the business.
I agree.
Right?
It's a great question, though, and definitely one that I'm glad to see he's thinking through early too.
This next question is interesting because this philosophical about promoting other things, but it's a question. So we have to. So what product did you use for mapping, Kelley?
We used Gibbis, GBBIS, and it's a very easy system to use. So you can absolutely reach out to someone from our firm if you need a connection made there.
Yeah, for sure. If you would like, reach out, and Kelley could connect you with Gibbis or Gibbis. I pronounce it wrong.
I think we all do, but yeah, that's okay. I think they asked for it with a name like that, personally.
No, Kelley, I would love to rename the company. No, but the service is good, and I will say, if I had to pick a big takeaway today is the pre-mapping conversation. I think is critical for any business, so critical, because otherwise you're awarding territories in the reverse, right?
Right.
So guys, I appreciate the questions. If anyone has more questions, feel free. We're at the 37-minute mark. I want to start wrapping it up. But Kelley, giving too much territory, not pre-mapping before selling, and your last lesson learned, which I love, is, and you phrased it with ethics, right? Having the ethics to not be convinced by someone that a territory is going to work if it doesn't meet your criteria. Yeah. Anything else to leave off with, Kelley?
It's never stop trying to improve it. I guess I can say, there was no point where we figured it out. This is our exact territory, be willing to adjust and adapt. And I, absolutely, to Charles' very early point, work with your legal team to make sure you're telling the right story with your item 19. Because they're going to lead in asking the right questions of, well, what type of sales were these? Should we separate them out by sales type? Should we be separating these out by population versus territory? And so, that item 19 tells such an important story in the sales process, and the territories and how you identify those are such an important component to telling the true story.
Yeah. And Kelley, the one thing I challenge everyone on, which was a point you raised, if you're going to award multiple territories, treat them like multiple businesses. And I love that you had them prepare a business plan of how they're going to expand and grow into these additional territories. And to me, that solves so many issues. Yeah. So many issues. Guys, thank you so much. Kelley, as always, this is awesome. Thank you, Kelley. And we'll see you guys next month for our next live stream. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you.